in Australia in the past couple of years, there's been a push from a number of groups, including politicians, for universities to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism. So there's been a letter sent to university chancellors over the last couple of years, pressing them to adopt this definition of anti-Semitism that is very broad, and it conflates anti-Semitism with legitimate criticism of the state of Israel. So that's number one. And the reason why that's important is because a number of universities have adopted, in Australia, have adopted that definition. And how it conflates anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel is in the examples that are provided in the definition. So there's two specific examples, and a good critique of this has been made by a number of human rights organizations, civil societies, and we've discussed this in Prague, Jamil. But the two ones that come to mind is the idea that anti-Semitism is denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination, and they're providing examples in this definition that claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor is anti-Semitism. So why this is important is because in this situation, it could be envisaged that claiming that policies of the state of Israel, for example, is discriminatory, can be anti-Semitism. And then the second example in the definition is applying a double standard. So this example kind of opens the door to the fact that as long as other human rights atrocities exist in the world, you can't criticize the state of Israel. So that's the definition, and this is before the recent protest movements on campuses. So this is a couple of years back, the pressures on universities to adopt this definition. So there's been not just by politicians, but a number of organizations across Australian society to adopt this definition. So this definition has been set in the psyche of many institutions in Australia, many politicians in Australia. So the result of this has been that just most recently, like last week, after the requests for arrest warrants were made, the opposition leader in Australia, so the alternative government, called the arrest warrants, the request for the arrest warrant, anti-Semitic. So there's been calls for people to be fired from their jobs, and people have been fired from their jobs in Australia before the protest movement for sharing Human Rights Watch articles, for example, on social media. There's been calls for other people to be sacked. So there is that deliberate conflation exists, and Gina, the special rapporteur, expressed before that there's certain groups that are targeted within this conflation and in this movement and at this moment. And right now in Australia today, alternative minister, shadow minister, called for students who are international students on campuses to be deported. So powers to be used to deport students because they're participating in protests. So right now, there has, so to move on to the student protests on campuses, they're about to start with, it followed the movement in America, obviously, and there's been over the last few months around nine universities around Australia that have had encampments present or protest camps present. And what have they faced? They've faced attacks such as fireworks being aimed at them. There have been verbal abuse. So in some incidents, dozens of men carrying Israeli and Australian flags enter the campsite, smashing marquees, taking food, and shaking the tents of students. There's also been responses from the institutions themselves, where they have threatened or have taken disciplinary actions against students for engaging in this protest on campus in Australia. And I think the biggest threat that we see at the moment and have seen is agitators, far-right agitators coming onto campus and making it unsafe for the pro-Palestinian encampments on campuses. We've been kind of lucky that the universities in Australia have had a more measured approach to the student-led protests on campuses. So when it first began at one of the first encampments, which is ongoing at the moment at the Sydney University in my hometown, the Vice Chancellor of that university spoke to the media and said that allowing the protests on campus is part of who we are. And then days after that, I've heard vice chancellors and especially the Vice Chancellor of Sydney University speak about the history of students' movements leading to positive change in Australia, and that needs to be balanced as a balance between people feeling safe on campuses, but also freedom of expression. So there is that understanding, but then there's the political pressure that is having its effect. So the political pressure calling for it to be shut down is having its effect. So there's been some encampments that have been ordered to close. Some have closed, others have closed with some demands being met. To answer the specific question that you asked, so police in Australia, especially in the state of Victoria, there's the Deputy Police Commissioner. He wrote to the University of Melbourne and a number of universities in Victoria saying that there is a strong likelihood that there will be violence between protesters and counter-protesters, and therefore police should be called in to deal with the situation before it's too late. That's essentially the essence of the letter. And the interesting part of it was that the universities, in my opinion, in their response, held to their position, most of them, that the universities are open spaces, they're public, and that the police are welcome. But at this time, the protests continue and the encampments continue. I think that's a response, and I think what the letter from the police also highlight is that they talk about, in the letter specifically, they talk about protesters, that's the pro-Palestinian movement encampment, and then the counter-protesters. So instead of speaking in a framework where protests can be allowed in a peaceful environment, where pro-Palestinian encampments can be protected from agitators and counter-protesters, they're talking about going in campuses and removing it. So that's the context. But then I think at the moment there are orders and directions being made by certain universities. Some campuses have closed. So it's that watch and see situation. A situation, what's happening in Gaza and to the Palestinian people, it's one of the first conflicts or assaults, and it's also been determined to be a plausible genocide that is being live streamed. Like, young people are getting it on their devices, right? And then what you're seeing is it's not just live streamed, but then the reaction, from my perspective, in Australia, the reaction of the politicians and our institutions, everything else, it's also being live streamed on a split screen. And we see the students being moved by what's going on in Gaza and what's happening to the Palestinian people. And they're demanding action, and they see the international human rights framework demanding action. But then, especially in Australia, I'm speaking in the Australian context, on the other side of the screen, our leaders and our institutions are either not doing anything or deliberately conflating the issue to not do anything about it. So I think this, for me, we will probably look back at this situation and the student movement same way in Australia that we look back at other protest movements led by students. Right now we don't look at it that way, but in the future it would be one that we probably think of when a crucial moment in this movement that awoke people's consciousness.